Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be taking a look at a new firmware update for PTZOptics SuperJoy camera. And the reason we're diving into this is it opens up a whole new set of features, one of which allows us to look at it from a scripting point of view and automation. But before we get to that, I'd like to remind everybody, please, if you have any questions, any comments, any feedback, just drop them in the comment section below. We'd also love to have you join us live on air and join us via video. So we have a link posted in the show notes where you can just copy and paste that into your browser and join us here in the studio. So let's get started. So probably about 3 months ago, I think it was episode 12, we did a fairly in-depth review of the PTZOptics SuperJoy PTZ controller. And we really came away incredibly impressed with that. Not only was the quality of the unit itself from sort of a software and a hardware perspective really high end, but the price was under $1,000. And we came away feeling this was probably the best sub $1,000 PTZ controller on the market today. So last week, or just maybe 2 weeks ago, they came out with a firmware upgrade that adds a lot of new features. Some of them are really under the cover type features, but others are pretty significant. And so I wanted to review that, then jump into how we could leverage those new capabilities inside vMix scripting. So we'll get into that now. So before we do that, actually, let me just see who's joined us here. So we have Rudy. Rudy, always, thank you for joining us. We have John Drinkwater. John, welcome from the UK. Great to see you here again, too. Thank you, John. And we have Richard from Sacramento. Richard, thanks for joining here. And we also have Dennis from Providence. So Dennis, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate all of this. So let's get started. The PTZOptics camera, I mentioned we did the review in episode 12. But before we dive in, I just want to give you a very brief overview, sort of to recap of some of the capabilities of the unit. And so I have one right here in front of me. And the layout is fairly straightforward with the joystick controller here, all of the selection controls here, some fine tuning knobs here so you can fine tune focus as well as fine tune the zoom. And then there are controls up in the upper left-hand corner that handle everything from iris and shutter, color balance, as well as the speed that the joystick controller will operate at. So a very clean layout. Over here in this section is where you select your cameras. You can call up cameras in different groups. So if I wanted to, there's a button here for the camera group. So I can just press that and select a group, and that will select that group of cameras. So you have, in the baseline, 4 main groups of 7 cameras each. So that's 28 cameras. But you also, in this new firmware update, they've added a 5th group. And I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But everything that we've discussed really falls into how to manage the interface without having to go and press buttons. So that's really one of the key new features that we're going to be diving into. So there's 2 other things that are a bit different here that I want to talk about. And the first one is that if you look across here, there are custom buttons, and these allow you to send out HTTP commands, which is very powerful because it means you can control other devices from the controller here. And the other thing, which we thought was really impressive, is whatever camera is selected, you can route the video for that camera out an HDMI port to a monitor. And that uses RTSP, So if your camera has RTSP as well as SDI or NDI, you can just pull that feed in, and when that feed is selected in the camera, you get a visual display of that. So very cool features here. But let me jump now. I put together a little PowerPoint. I'm not a huge PowerPoint person, so I will try to avoid PowerPoint syndrome where everybody falls asleep. But I just wanted to capture a few of the things here so we had a visual reference for it. So let me go through here. The general updates that were made available as part of this release included a new automatic camera discovery feature. Now, we've played a bit with this. We didn't really get a chance to dig in too deeply, but what it will let you do is it will let you find any PTZOptics cameras that could be on your network automatically, and then assign them to specific camera positions inside the controller. It'll also do the same with NDI. And what makes the NDI piece interesting, and again, I want to emphasize we haven't had a chance to really work with this yet, so I'm giving you more of the bullet points that I have around the firmware, is that it will work with NDI bridge, which means that you will get PTZ control of a camera at a remote location now and have that ability baked into your physical controller. Definitely a very cool thing and something we will be testing out in the future. But just a point to keep in mind for how they extended some of the things that they were doing. The other is that there's broader URL support for the custom buttons. Now, I just mentioned those, and those custom buttons will let you trigger external HTTP requests to have other devices take actions that all from this controller. The initial release had quite a few limitations. This update now basically allows you to construct almost all valid URL constructs that you can have, and it supports all of that. So again, a very nice to have feature, especially around automation, something we're really keen on working with here. The next thing, as I mentioned, is they've added a 5th camera group now. And what makes this interesting is that unlike the other camera groups, which support from cameras 1 to 7, this 5th camera group supports up to 170 cameras. Now, I am not sure that there's anybody running even the largest productions using that many cameras. So what I'm hoping for, and we'll get to spend more time with this and talk more with PTZOptics about what the thinking is behind this capability, but it may be something which would allow you to control virtual cameras. So if you had different types of conferencing software, there may be some software mechanism on the remote side that could take advantage of that. So that's a question mark I'm putting out there, but we thought it was a really interesting step, especially given the types of productions people are working on today. So the next thing, and this is really going to impact people overseas, the HDMI port now supports both 50 and 60 hertz, and you can toggle based on what you need with that. So that should support more of the frame rates that are outside the US and could be a plus there. The other thing, which sounds like something that would have been there in the beginning, but it wasn't, is that when you select the camera button and press that button, the light of the selected camera button now stays lit. So it lets you know when it's there. So these are the main general updates that were part of this. But there were 2 more updates that I want to talk about in a little more detail. And the first one is the addition of dynamic DNS. So this isn't something we've really talked about in the past. But what dynamic DNS will let you do is it'll let you, like regular DNS, assign a name to an IP address. And what makes it different, however, is that for a lot of people, you don't have what's called a static IP address. You get an IP address from your ISP that will allow you to use that for some period of time and then it can change. It refreshes after, like, expiring after 14 days or 30 days or even shorter periods of time. And so you aren't guaranteed to have the same IP address. So what dynamic DNS lets you do is you can run a piece of software inside of your own network that will talk to a host and keep updating it with whatever that potentially changing IP address is. So it lets things from the outside work like traditional DNS, where you just type in a name and it translates to an IP address, but you don't need a static IP address to do it. This can be done in people's routers. It can be done with a piece of software that's sort of a dynamic DNS client that will run on a box inside of your network, or it can run on devices like the SuperJoy. And so in the SuperJoy, you get to set all of this up. You have all the things you can put, the address you want, the domain, and your login. And this will go out to an external provider. This is no-IP, and they do dynamic DNS, but you can get everything set up here. Now, probably the next logical question is, so why? What does it matter? And the way to think of this is, if you want to be able to set up and control the SuperJoy controller, you need to connect to it. And the interface, as you could see, let me sort of just pop back again. This interface here is the interface. It's a web browser interface that the SuperJoy provides for doing all the configuration. And what this dynamic DNS lets you do is you can now provide a name to somebody remotely that they can use to connect to your SuperJoy device and do any changes to configuration, setup, adding cameras, changing presets. All of those things now, because you have dynamic DNS, can be done remotely. Now, you could do it remotely if you had a static IP address, but for a lot of small organizations, churches, even lots of academic institutions, especially, before the college level, a lot of these just have standard internet and will not have a static IP. So this lets people now, no matter what that IP address is, you can give somebody the URL they need to connect to your SuperJoy and manage all the configurations for it. Or even do some switching, because the web interface does let you toggle through presets and do other things like that. So very cool capability in this. And what you'll end up getting when you see this is people will type in a URL that will look something like this. So this is how we have the SuperJoy URL set up here. So if anybody connected, this is how you would do that from outside. And it also, one of the other features which sort of go hand in hand with this, you have the ability to customize the port you are using to connect to the SuperJoy. And that can be just a security thing, but it gives you now this ability to get all of these things set up the way you need them, conforming to some type of baseline IT protocol where things are now well managed. You can go by names and you don't have to worry about trying to keep everybody in sync. Just type in the name and you can connect. What this will require is port forwarding. So that requirement does not change. It is still the same thing as if you had a static IP address. We would tell somebody connect to this IP and this port to get to this device. But you'd now, because that IP address can change, you're covered. So the next thing is the thing that I am most excited about, which is an HTTP API. But before we get into that, I think we have a few more people that have joined us here. So we have Bill, Bill from south of London in the UK. Bill Mute, thank you very much for joining us and spending your Friday night here with us. Definitely appreciate it. And we have Daniel Sword. Good evening, Daniel. Thank you very much for joining us here today. So let's get back to automation. This is the part that gets me excited here. So there everything that you can do with making selections with sort of the button pushes, you now have the ability to do that through automation. So the first thing you could do is you can turn on or off the HDMI output. So if you have a camera and you wanted to see that output, you could do that. An example we have here is our camera is, our controller is actually going out through a NDI converter. And that NDI converter using something like NDI Bridge could let you see this remotely. So if you were doing remote controls and other things, you have that ability now not just to see the cameras, but to turn that off or on if I wanted to share that externally as well. The next thing is you can trigger all of the custom buttons. So there are 4 custom buttons here. So you can trigger those to launch other commands. And again, just another thing that makes this work more efficiently. The third is you can select any camera you want. And as I mentioned, cameras come in groups and camera numbers. So with this, groups 1 to 4, cameras 1 to 7 in each group. And then group 5 goes from 1 to 170. So that's definitely something interesting. But so you can select a camera in a group. You can select a camera and recall a preset. So you can do that as one step now. So you can go in there and say, okay, take camera 2 in group 3 and go to preset 4. And you can do that as a single HTTP command that can be triggered from anything external. You also can just recall a preset on whatever camera you're on. So if you have presets that are structured around sort of coordinated things across cameras. So preset 1 on all my cameras is a close-up on a certain guest. Preset 2 is a mid shot, and preset 3 is a wide shot. This lets you, regardless of which camera is selected, just select my close shot, my medium shot, and my wide shot. And so you can handle it that way as well. Now, the other thing is it does let you query the status of the controller, which will tell you what group, what camera are selected. And there's a few other points of information. So there's not a lot there that you really wouldn't get by looking at the interface. But this will give this back in JSON format, and you could tear that apart inside of code. So the first thing to think about, we set this up as 2 ways. One, I set up HTTP commands through a Stream Deck. And this will allow me just to press a button on a Stream Deck and make different camera selections. So right here, if I point down at the controller here, let's see if we can get that shot in. I now have a Stream Deck over here, and I'm just going to push the button. So we're going to go to camera 2. You can see it's changing, camera 3 and camera 4. And this is just pushing buttons now on a Stream Deck. It doesn't give you a lot more than I get simply by pressing buttons 1, 2, 3, and 4 here on the interface, but it lets you do this now through an external device as well. So very cool there. The other piece, though, is that we can now do this through scripting. So let me get out of the PowerPoint, open this script up so we can take a look. So in scripting, what we're going to do is we're going to basically, for this script, we're going to look at the camera that we place in preview inside of vMix. And anytime we put a PTZ camera into the vMix preview, it'll automatically change the controls on the SuperJoy to be pointing to that camera. So this means just like a director would normally switch, a TD would normally switch on a production, whatever camera they switch to, you will now have that automatically switch for whoever your camera operator is. And that will give you very streamlined workflow. You don't need now to say, camera 2 in preview, camera 3 in preview, or anything like that. When it's there, it will change right on the controller. And because the controller has an HDMI out, the camera operator will now see a visual of the camera that's in preview and can just make any types of adjustments they want technically on the interface. No switching on their part is required now. And that's what the script is going to do. So let's get started going through it. So what we want to do to make this more efficient is we want to look and say, which was the last camera we told you to select? And that's what the previous, the preview input was. That's basically saying what camera's in preview, and then the old preview, which is these are these two lines right here, this line and this line here. So the old preview says what was the last camera switch we told the controller to make, because we don't want to keep looking at preview and hammering the controller with going to the same camera. So we're going to make sure we can tell the last camera command we sent versus who we find in preview, and make sure that we just tell the controller once. So the other thing that we're introducing here that is new and interesting is we're introducing two new data types that we need for doing these HTTP requests. So the first one is a web request, and the second one is a web response. In a web request, you basically set up the URL that you are going to be using as your web trigger, what you're going to call. And then you have a way to say, okay, execute that and give me a response. And that's what we have with web response. So with the web request, we're going to say, this is the camera that I want you to make active. So that's why we call it active cam. And then when we trigger it, we'll get a web response. And that's the trigger response that we get there. So let's talk a little bit more about how this process will work. As always, we dive into getting the vMix XML, and we do that by setting this up as a XML document. And then inside a loop, because this is going to be running continuously in the background, we then load that vMix XML document in so we can start to look at the state of things. And while this loop is running, we'll go through and very easily we just say, give me the number of the input that's inside of preview. And for us, what we did is we have our cameras set up in inputs 1 to 4 because we really weren't looking to show a lot of string parsing or anything else. So all we're doing is if preview is on 1, we switch to camera 1. If preview is on input 2, we switch to camera 2. So it's a very streamlined thing, but you could add whatever additional code you'd want to work in, something a little more sophisticated that fit in with your model. But so what we do is we pull that text out, and then we do our first check. And the first check is, okay, is the input that's sitting in preview the same as the last one that we told the SuperJoy to switch to? And so if that's the case, we just sleep for a second and then say, okay, go back up and continue the while loop. And that's a very simple, just breaks from here, goes back and starts the while loop at the top again. If it isn't, if we haven't told the controller to go to this, the camera that's in preview yet, we now set the old preview to the current request, and we do 3 commands around this. The first one is we set up the web request, and we do this by web request with a method of create. And that is just a URL that we have right here, and we append the input that the camera input that we want the controller to switch to. And so that sets this up, and it creates this web request and stores it in the variable ActiveCam that we mentioned before. We then trigger that by doing ActiveCam get response. And what this will do is it'll execute that web command and pull back whatever web response we get from that, and that will be stored in trigger response. And at that point, now that we have this value back, we can just, we're not looking at it beyond making sure it happened, then we'll just come back and say, okay, close this response because we don't want to be eating up memory, keeping multiple responses, and sleep for a second and loop back. And that's it. It seems like we're doing something fairly sophisticated, but the scripting for it, now that we have this API command, this HTTP API command from PTZOptics for the SuperJoy, this becomes really, really easy. So let's take a look at this in action. So I'm going to start this up running as a loop in the background. And let's see if we can set this up. So here we go. If you look at the controller, I think you can see this. You can see that camera 4 is lit up. So what I'm going to do is over here, I'm going to take and I'm going to move camera 3 into preview. So that you do that just by clicking on it. And now you can see that camera 3 now is represented over here just by doing this click. So the same if I move to camera 2 or camera 1. So now we have this automatically changing based on what's going on here. So very, very streamlined workflow. You don't have to do anything special as an operator, as a camera operator, to have control. So what's great here is if I look, I can simply turn around and say, okay, this is set there, and I'm just making whatever adjustments right on the camera. And then if I go over, let's see, we'll switch this to here. So now I can make this go. So I can just pull this out. And again, nothing that needs to be done by the operator here. It's a tactile thing. As soon as it changes, I can dial in whatever I want. I can go and switch to any of the presets. Everything works for me just by having a new camera placed into preview. So that's the show for today. We wanted to make sure we sort of gave you a general overview of the SuperJoy with the new firmware update. And we really wanted to just dive in a bit into this new area of scripting where we start to trigger external activities along with the script that we're running inside of vMix. So hopefully you found this interesting. It's something that we'll definitely be adding to the scripting mix that we're using as part of the material we cover in the show, because we think having that type of capability is really interesting, not just here, but in general with everything else that we do with automation. So before we end the show and go to the post show, I just want to say hi to a few more people. So we had Daniel just said, thanks, love your videos. Daniel, we really appreciate, everybody being part of this community. And so that's something sincerely all of us really, really love having as part of the overall community here. That sense that people tune in and share and talk. So thank you for that. We also have Dennis. Dennis is wishing us a good evening from the Netherlands. So Dennis, as always, anybody that's coming to us where it's Friday evening, I appreciate that we make it up your list of things to do on a Friday evening. That's that is really nice, and I love the fact that you're joining us here from the Netherlands. So thank you. We also have Stephen Hayward. He says, now you need to figure out how to do that with TriCaster. So yeah, it is very possible to do with TriCast, and that is probably something, for this season, we have spent a lot of time with vMix and scripting in vMix, but we are, like I've mentioned many times, we are really big TriCaster fans as well. We use that to switch our show here. So we will definitely add more TriCaster focused things and also more general scripting things which apply across multiple types of production switches. So we also have Team 4M is wishing us hi from Germany. Team 4M, thank you for joining us here. This is great. So, all right, everyone. So we will be hanging around for an after show. So if you have any other questions or anything you'd like to dive into, whether it's about SuperJoy, scripting, live streaming in general, we're happy to talk about it. If you can't stay around, we will definitely see you all on the next show. But if you can, we'll see you in a couple of seconds. Take care, everyone. If we don't see you, have a great week. Hello, welcome back everybody to the after show here. So we missed Joey. O2 Joey, I am sorry. I missed you on the list. Thank you very much for joining us from the UK. So that is great, and I appreciate you making the time to spend it with us and to comment. So thank you for both of those. So sorry we missed you there. So this was when we got the update. Probably one of our friends over at PTZOptics sent us an early look at this, and we got to spend a little time with it, and we were just really impressed. It seems that there is a true focus now on extending the automation and granularity of control in PTZOptics product line. They, for instance, have done a camera update, one of the features of which gives you smoother, slower motion in the cameras. So definitely things that are focusing now on the needs of the higher end of the market. And we love the fact that not only are they sort of focusing more there, but they're doing a lot more around automation with HTTP APIs. So really looking forward to what they do. And I mentioned it during the show. I'm really curious about what they want to do with Group 5, which has 170 remote cameras in it. And the only thing that I think would be useful is if there's some way on the other end that we could leverage this to either control lots of different uh, data sources, so things that you get where if you were doing a big conference and had lots of individual remote participants, so something like that, or it may be something else they have in mind around automation control that isn't fully played out yet, that they may have some other things they'd like to do. Either that or they think they're going to be able to sell a lot more cameras to people and set them up in shows. So, I definitely don't think there'll be that many people with that many cameras. But if you know of use cases specifically that this may apply to, please share them because it's not something that we've normally run across. But love to hear, anybody else's experience out there. The other piece that we thought was interesting was the dynamic DNS. And I'll be honest, when the, we were first told about dynamic DNS, our mind went to using dynamic DNS for remote cameras. So if I could actually control a camera by name at a remote location over something like SRT or that type of connection. We thought that was an interesting thing. It turned out that it really was the other way to give people the ability to control the uh, SuperJoy itself. But this is definitely something we're hopeful will come in the future, especially with things like NDI Bridge or Bird Dog Cloud, other cloud-based SRT infrastructures, or like Bird Dog, the NewTek Bridge, NDI Bridge is not SRT, but it's reliable UDP, similar vein. So I think this could be really interesting as this plays out for how this develops. But their NDI uh, model for controlling PTZ cameras should work across NDI Bridge. So we'll have to play with that in the future and see how well that works. But again, there's a lot of forward-looking stuff in here. So I do want to open this up. So if anybody has any questions, please put them up, and we'll try to get to them here. The other thing, though, that we looked at when we did this was the basically going to the web request and the web response components. We really haven't done a lot with them, and this is the first time we've ever done them in a script on the show. But we're going to be spending a little more time figuring out the limits of what we can do with this, what it will let us do, how much data we can actually pull back, and see if there's some interesting things we can do with parsing return data to basically repackage and display inside productions. So something else to keep in mind for this. These capabilities are pretty powerful, and we always struggle to find things that are still supported in earlier versions of .NET. So like vMix is in the 2.x realm of .NET, and they've just recently released version 6. So there's hopefully, as I've mentioned in the past, we'll get some more automation capabilities that embrace the newer versions of .NET. But even within the 2.x versions, we're trying to mine out everything we can that we think would be interesting here. So it looks like we don't have any other questions. So we'll probably do a wrap up. I know this is a slightly shorter show this week, but I nonetheless appreciate everybody carving out this time here to be part of it with us. And if we don't get to anything that you may have missed asking, we'll answer it in the comments. So post comments on YouTube or Facebook, and we'll respond to that. So thank you all for hanging out for a little bit in the after show, and we will see you next show. Take care, everyone. Thank you.